And most of all, thanks to the Center for Urban History for granting me the chance to stay here for a few weeks in this wonderful city. I'm leaving in a few days, but it was a great staying here, so thank you. And also for the time spent with the colleagues and for all the time spent in the library using your very rich collection of books, so thanks for this chance. So, I'll start telling you that at the top of the Arsenal Hill, which is one of the Bucharest highest points, there is an impressive construction site is at work. Even at late night, workmen, cranes, aerial work platforms are still in action, illuminated by imposing floodlights. Hectic work have to be kept up to build the world's biggest Christian Orthodox religious complex within December 2018. The Cathedral for the Salvation of the Romanian people is rising right at the back of the most known symbol of the city, the Palace of the Parliament, a landmark of the late Ceausescu era. Many aspects of this ambitious project are controversial and engender heated debates locally as well as on a national level. My presentation is divided in two parts. The first section is dedicated to the project of the National Cathedral. The second instead starts from the assumption that Bucharest public space has been marked with religious symbols immediately after the communist regime fell, and attempts to interpret this process outside the canonical paradigm of religious revival. So as you can see, okay, let's use this beautiful device. This is the cathedral rising, and this is the huge Palace of the Parliament, and imagine the cathedral will tower over the Palace of the Parliament. It's going to be around 40 meters higher. So from this area, which is the city center, you will be able to see a couple on top of the symbol of state atheism. This is also, I mean, this picture is a bit older and it's from another perspective. This is newer. And you can see that the project dates back to 1881, but the construction work started only 7 years ago. That's a pic I took during my field work. And you can imagine how big is it, that this is a man. And this is the iconostasis. It's concrete, made of concrete, and it's like around 60 meters, maybe a little less, 40 meters tall. This is how the project will look like in a few years. The cathedral will be ready the next year, and then they will build other 4 buildings, a few rooms in the underground, and even a surface for landing helicopters, parking helicopters. I don't know if you say in English. These are instead some of the cathedrals built in Romania, in other cities, smaller cities. Some of them are not bigger than 50,000 inhabitants, so they're quite small, but the cathedrals are huge, as you can see. If we compare Romania, who has built 27 Orthodox cathedrals in 27 years, with Ukraine, because Ukraine, which is a way bigger country, has built, according to the data I have, around 16 cathedrals since 1991. One of these is Roman Catholic, 5 belong to the Orthodox Church affiliated to the Moscow Patriarchate, 3 to the Orthodox Church of the Kiev Patriarchate, and 7 to the Greek Catholic Church. But let's go back to Bucharest. So, on November the 3rd, 2015, in Bucharest, a city well trained with demonstrations in the last years, 15,000 people rose up against the main political institutions deemed responsible for a dramatic accident, which caused the death of dozens of youngsters. in a club. The lack of public participation of support for the victims by the Romanian Orthodox Church during the 3 days of national mourning was the spark for the burst of anti-clerical sentiments. Many people's discontent was due to the cold attitude that some Orthodox priests kept regarding the fire at the club. Since it happened during a hard rock concert, some clergymen justified the tragedy as a direct consequence of the celebration of Satanist music. This is one of the forms of protests during these days. And as you can see, this means we want hospitals, no cathedrals, and here also we want hospitals. And this is a Orthodox article shop in Bucharest, in the downtown. And that's a pun that basically prefericit means his beatitude, but means literally too much happy, so it's a way to mock the patriarch. And this is also a way to mock the patriarch, as you can see, as a man was dressed up as the patriarch and was pretending to sell indulgences for money. And again here some people protesting against the Romanian Orthodox Church and against this state, as 4,200 Orthodox churches, monasteries, cathedrals and chapels were erected in 26 years, about one in every 2 days and a half. Beyond the Orthodox Church, according to State Secretary for Religious Affairs, the Orthodox Church is not the most active in terms of church constructions, as Baptists, Adventists and Pentecostals represent only the 3% of the religious population, but have been able to build the 40% of the houses of worship erected in the whole country after 1990. And the only other denomination building a cathedral in Romania is the Greek Catholic Church, which chose to erect it in Cluj, Transylvania. The construction of churches in post-socialist countries is one of the ways the religious resignification of the public space occurs. This process unfolds through material, in our case churches, cathedrals and crosses, or immaterial means, like public rituals, processions and pilgrimages, and has been interpreted by social scientists as a proof of religious revival, like Miklos Tomka, for example, revitalization, Gerd Pickel, religious renewal, Monica Heinz, like the sunset of the secular age, or the dawn of a new post-secular era. Instead, I suggest to follow what Catherine Vergery says about this, and I would quote one excerpt from one of her books, most recent book in 1999, The Political Lives of Dead Bodies. So the most common ways in which political regimes mark space are by placing particular statues in particular places, and by renaming landmarks such as street, pubs, squares and buildings. These provide contour to landscapes, socializing them and saturating them with specific political values. They signify space in specific ways. Raising and tearing down statues gives new values to space, it resignifies it, just as it does renaming streets and buildings. I put italics there because I think maybe for some of you it's raising a bell with the recent laws in your country about tearing down statues, so I guess there is a sort of a parallel between Romania and Ukraine also in this regard. So, taking the cue from Vergery's reflections, I inquired the re-consecration of the Bucharest cityscape after 1990. I prefer talking about the recent re-consecration because this term is more neutral, as it simply reflects the act of carrying out a religious ritual in a specific place. Church building and cross-building activities are a contested field and do not just reflect a religious revival or the sacralization of the public space. Space has been reconsecrated through religious representation, but the meaning of this process is not unequivocal, as it is negotiated and debated about among many actors. On the one hand, church building activities and the monumentalization of the cross have been a widespread practice pursued by more or less institutionalized group as part of the dominant anti-communist discourse. On the other hand, anti-clerical sentiments and secularist ideals are stronger than ever, and the protests we have seen before are a proof of this. So if the label of religious revival seems now to be outdated, how should we understand the coexistence of such divergent phenomena in today's Bucharest? Cross-placing activities are a consequence and not a cause of what has been called sacralization of the space. That is, the reorganization of public space through religious signifiers that supposedly make it sacred. Since this is far from being undisputed, I suggest that a less latent term like re-consecration is more suitable. First of all, it renders more clearly the act of anti-communist purification, which is so common in many other countries of the former socialist bloc. Also, it's undeniable that many rituals of consecration have been conducted, as witnessed by the widespread presence of crosses, churches and cathedrals after 1990. Instead, scholars using unproblematically formulations like religious revival or sacralization link the visibility of religious symbols and edifice with a growth in faith, belonging and religious practice. But at the same time, they ignore the political side of this process. So, contemporary sacred placemaking can be only grasped by labeling it a simple process of sacralization of the public space. While until the first half of the 20th century, concepts like secularization and disenchantment became popular among social scientists who tried to make sense of the cultural change brought by modernity. The same can't be told of the term sacred, which has remained untouched and is still widely used today to portray the swift resurgence of the religious in the built environment. Needless to say, this happened because the secularization paradigm imagined a future stripped of the sacred. However, in order to overcome this stalemate, I resort to an alternative phrasing like re-consecration and try to grasp cross-monumentalization as the creation of places which are sacred in the secular sense of the term. This is Father Andrei. I had the chance to meet him. He is the priest of a church very close to University Square, which is the square you can see here, and is the priest in charge of the university chapel. So since the university is there, all the students, the Christian Orthodox students, go to this church, which you can't see because I forgot to put it in the presentation. Anyway, that's not the point. The point is that he is, in this moment, is chancing the main cross in this square, and he's doing it here because, according to a recently voted law, national heroes must be commemorated on the same day of the Feast of the Ascension. So a religious feast like the Ascension Day and a political moment like the celebration of those who died during the Romanian Revolution converge in the same place and at the same moment. So, University Square is a secular sacred space, or better said, it's a sacred space in the secular sense of the term. To make a secular space indeed holy, something important must have happened. University Square is a sacred place not because of the crosses planted there, but because of the events of the 99er revolution and 1990 period. Crosses remind us that this specific place is special, even though it's part of Bucharest everyday traffic, but do not make it sacred. They rather remind us that it is a sacred place. What make it sacred are the historical events that happened there, the death of many innocent people, and the fact that every time Bucharest people feel indignated and want to voice their disappointment, they meet there. After 1989, it reflects a powerful ideal of Christian communion, but also a symbol of civil participation. In fact, during my interview with Father Andrei, the priest in the picture, he defined the square as a sacred place managed under students' authority for months after the revolution. It is before that crosses were planted. So the priest himself was defining the place as sacred even before the crosses were planted. And at this point, I would like to bring another small interview that I had with a famous Romanian Orthodox icon painter about the importance of this place. He told me that there was an enthusiasm pouring out University Square that sadly in the meanwhile has vanished. In that square there was a truly flying church. There I experienced Christian communion as I never did in any other brick church. I still did something similar on Easter night, when dawn comes and it's only me, a few friends and some other churchgoer. The majority of the people heads to home to scoff down eggs, sweet bread and wine. But those few who stay, we are the true church. Okay, yes. We would need him here in order to understand more what he meant, because it's a very particular character, but still, I think he gave a good his words were quite telling for how important is University Square for Romanians and for Bucharest people. So therefore, I understand a sacred place as making those getting interaction with it to change their behavior in specific ways. For instance, a believer entering a church will perceive it as a sacred place and thus adopt a different attitude when getting in contact with sacred objects like icons and relics, praying, talking to the priest, and so on. So if we stick to this general interpretation of the term, to speak of post-socialist sacralization of a space is at times misleading. The usage of religious signifiers is rather an act of re-consecration and symbolical purification of the space, laden with political meaning and whose religious character is to be associated with that celebration. Let's bring an example of re-consecration of the space that would be inappropriate to label as sacralization. A few hundred meters north of University Square, there is another cross rising in the middle of what is called Roman Square. It was placed in the 2000 by an association of Orthodox students. Generally, crosses have indeed an important role for believers, as some of them believe that as soon as two wooden boards are joined, forming a cross and blessed, they are imbued with divine power. But nobody but a few zealots would say that Roman Square is a sacred place. No rituals are conducted there, and no one adopts a deferential attitude when entering the square. The cross adorns a space otherwise dedicated to traffic circulation. Okay, so just to let you understand, it's a little map I prepared with all the cross-shaped monuments erected after 1990. This is University Square, this is Roman Square where we were before, and the next slide is about Revolution Square. So we move a few hundred meters westward from University Square, and we find again a very iconic place. Revolution Square is famous for having welcomed Ceausescu's last speech, until he got booed and shouted by the crowd in revolt on 21st of December 1989. Two crosses lie in this square in a very discreet manner, remaining almost unnoticed in the eyes of the observer. The first is a cross-shaped bust of Corneliu Copoșu, this one, who was a conservative Greek Catholic politician who spent 9 years in jail in the 1950s, as he was a political prisoner. The second instead is a two-dimensional cross paved under the Memorial of Rebirth. This is the memorial, and you can really see the cross here and then, of course, here. While the bust is located here, and then there is the Crețulescu Church, a very old and beautiful church. While this was the balcony where Ceausescu was booed in 1989. So even though the cross is generally considered being a symbol of death, many of the crosses I traced in my map are rather related to resurrection, celebrating the end of something and most of all the start of something else. The name itself of the memorial in Revolution Square, Rebirth, hints at the end of the totalitarian regime and the wish of establishing a new solid democracy. The wooden paved cross under the obelisk is therefore an allegory of hope for the new post-socialist era. However, cultural heritage manager Maria Bercea described the final decision-making process for the Rebirth Memorial in the hands of one single person, the then Social Democrat president of the Republic, Ion Iliescu, who allegedly simply chose the project that he liked the most. Iliescu was the first president of post-revolutionary Romania, and albeit he had been for decades a high party member of the Communist Party during the Communist regime, he is now here being presented as the champion of Christianity. He is here now choosing a project that has a cross as a main symbol. So the same people that promoted state atheism during communism now are presented as champions of Christianity and faith. The monumentalization of the 1989 revolution has resulted in an extensive usage of the cross, intended not just as a symbol of death commemoration, but also as a symbol of resurrection, as we just said. The actors behind such a process are also Christian intellectuals, like the first post-regime Minister of Culture, Andrei Pleșu, and important artists like Paul Neagu, who was the author of this cross, which is called by Bucharest citizens also the biscuit, in a greater tongue-in-cheek version. While this is called by local citizens the impaled, the bleeding potato, and also the olive on a toothpick. So Bucharest people don't really like this kind of monument. So as I was saying, there are also prominent artists like Paul Neagu and Horia Bernea. The latter, Bernea, was the son of a famous ethnologist, Ernest Bernea, and he himself was a painter, and he was appointed director of the Museum of the Romanian Peasant. And this is how he presented the reorganization of the museum in the early 1990s. You think to hold that was destroyed in this country to what is needed and what you can do. And a vast but unequivocal subject takes the shape, the cross. After decades of huge destructions caused by peasantry, by communism, it would have been necessary a political exhibition, an appraisal of the horrors suffered by Romanian villages. But we did not go along this path, which would have been understandable but full of verdicts. The cross was the most suitable theme, the one fullest of life. So again, cross is not necessarily associated with death. Why to demonstrate the omnipresence of the cross? To let people realize that they cannot live without the cross. We are doing here a public gesture. To opt for this topic is a confession. It means to reaffirm the omnipresence of the cross, its importance and power today in a world astray, secularized, which turned evil. It's a militant act. Now, the word of this museum curator and museum manager let us spread the atmosphere of religious effervescence lingering in the country in the 1990s. So cross-placing was intended as a moral statement and as a militant act. But 20 years later, things seem to have changed radically. Inspired by a secularist conceptions of the urban public space, the new generation of local artists, born in the 1970s and in the 1980s, reads the re-consecration phenomenon not anymore as a militant act, but rather as a dominant discourse that must be denounced. We passed from the hammer and sickle to the cross, told me Mihai Balco, a plastic artist in his 30s. At the time of my fieldwork, along the boulevard connecting University and Roman Square, his installation made of yellow pipes stood for several months, attracting the puzzled look of who walked by. The tubes were connected so that they formed a cross and a church bell. These are the church bells. Balco intended to show the continuities during and after socialism in respect of how authorities, the Communist Party back then and the Orthodox Church now, address masses. Socialist times are reminded by the usage of pipes and hydric infrastructure, while the Orthodox Church is reminded by the choice of putting crosses and bells. Maybe you already read the placard nearby, the monument addressed the mutation of the symbolic system in the public space from the single party to the single religion, our salvation of us all. And the energy spent for building factories and plants are now directed for erecting the new factories of orthodoxy, together with the omnipresence of crosses which mark the place of a violent death. So the anti-communist discourse has represented a common ground for very different political actors in Romania after 1990. From neoliberals to neo-fascists, Christian conservatives and social democrats, all of them gained political capital by blaming their opponents of being communist or nostalgic of the regime. Most importantly, the populist rhetoric embraced by such discourse dwells on the ruptures between now and then. For the same logic, the national cathedral is supposed to purify what was defiled by communists, to celebrate the victory of religion over this atheist regime. All this will soon epitomize by an evocative image, the cathedral for the salvation of the people towering over the house of the people. But how this could ever happen if the likeness between the two is so patent? Sharing the subject to which they are dedicated, the people, the magnificent scale, the public source of funding and the very same location, one would be rather convinced of the striking continuities that bind Romanian before and after the December of 1989. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you for this condensed and rich presentation, and I can open the discussion now. I hope you have questions. Yes, Iras-Klokina.
Thank you so much. My questions will be very brief and very simple. So first is about ruptures and continuities with your actors. So actually, for me, it's quite interesting. Are these sculptors, artists, who now are engaged in constructing crosses, churches, and maybe some, I don't know, figures or religious monuments as well? I suppose maybe you also have that. If they were also active as artists during the socialist period, or they basically have this lucky position to present themselves as just opponents of the regime. Because, you know, in our country, so many artists who constructed Lenin later started to construct different things. And my second question is also about your actors. If you can also see some alternative ways of using crosses and other religious symbols, not only for changing the meaning of the place in political terms, but also in some kind of economical terms, or some other ways to use these symbols. Because once again, from our Lviv perspective, it's also very nice to have the figure of Mother of God put on the place of illegal construction, so you can stop this construction, or you can actually use this in a very big, number of ways. For example, to also not to let your neighbor to put his car in front of the entrance of the house. So that is a very good way to actually claim the space in a different sense, not in a political or religious sense. Thank you.
Should I reply to each question? Or? Yeah. Okay, thanks for your questions. I'll start from the last. Indeed, I mean, the difference between the Lviv case and an Orthodox city like Bucharest would be the fact that a city that is for a great majority Greek Catholic can use as statues, while in an Orthodox city statues are not supposed to be there, but rather icons, so bidimensional sacred objects. So you can easily find icons everywhere, but no statues. And most of all, you will also see flags of the Romanian flag, often at the entrance of churches, or projected, being on chapels, on churches and chapels. And in this respect, I was a bit that had an impact on my Catholic upbringing, to see symbol of nation close to the symbol of religion, such a church, and that was striking to see for me. But there it was totally fine to associate a national symbol like a flag to a religious one. So it's common to see icons, but what would be a statue in Lviv would be an icon in Bucharest. So usually an icon of the Virgin Mary is rightly said. And about the first, unluckily I couldn't meet artists that were active, were active already during socialist times, but that icon painter I quoted during the talk, Sorin Dumitrescu, and he was working as an icon painter all along his life, and he's now regretting that the union for plastic artists is not there anymore, and he preferred way more to work during socialist time, even though he was always a committed religious person. So even though it was hard for him to leave his faith during state atheism, in respect of his profession, he found himself way better under socialist times and not after it. And that was his point of view. But, that's the only witness I can talk about, because all the other artists I talk with were young people that experienced socialism just when they were children.
Thank you for the lecture. My two small questions are, first, can we say that Romania jumped from fake socialism to fake, let's say, religiousness, Christianity? Because you mentioned Romania as a socialist country, and the name was Romanian Socialist Republic during the Soviet times. But after the collapse of communism in the Soviet Union, Romanian communism also, or socialism, collapsed. So it was imposed. It was not the product of the country. So it was fake socialism, as I would say. And turning to building, well, churches, this sacralization of the public space, it's not true, I would not say that it's true Christianity, because a Christian is a man who, well, who knows the teaching of Jesus Christ and who believes that the teaching is correct and true and follows this. So building these churches and such activities, because maybe we can draw parallel with people who are living in Lviv. Well, our small group once upon a time was asking people whether they know 10 commandments of our Lord, what was the second commandment, and only 1 in 10 persons could correctly say what is the second commandment of. So the question is once again, so jump from fake socialism to fake Christianity. And the second will not be so long. Well, can you compare what this church building in Romania with church building in other let's say non-Soviet republics, like German Democratic Republic, if they are building this, if they are so active in this, or is it characteristic of Romania or southern countries to, well, just this church building and consecralization of public space? Thank you.
So again, talking about comparisons, in terms of, for example, national cathedrals, the most striking similarity, as far as I could find during my research, was with Poland. Because even though Poland is a Catholic country, they are building a temple of divine providence in Warsaw, again with public money, and it's a very big religious building. So there are similarities with the Bucharest case. And they also built a very big cathedral in Licen. I don't know how to pronounce it, but and at that time it was exclusively with donations. So in terms of churches built, it was hard for me to find data outside Romania, because I can't speak the language of neighboring countries. But in terms of cathedrals, as I told already, Ukraine is already a good example, because you built 16 cathedrals at least so far, but also Poland, for the fact that they're building a cathedral in the capital. And also Poland is a country with a huge majority of Catholics, as much as Romania is a country with a huge majority of Orthodox, while in Ukraine things are a bit more fragmented, so that's harder to compare. And talking about fake socialism and fake Christianity, I agree on the fact that it was fake socialism in the sense in which Romania in '47 had the smallest communist party of the whole socialist bloc. So in Romania it was indeed, I mean, you can say it was an imposition in many cases, but in Romania it was especially striking, because there was the party had no power at all. It was indeed a geopolitical move that came after the World War II. And also the commitment of many party cadres was very unstable. And I can suggest Catherine Verger about this topic says a lot of things about how party cadres themselves define themselves as party members, not as communists, which is not the very same things, rightly so. So you can say that socialism wasn't indeed as much as believed like it could have been in other parts of the socialist and Soviet bloc. But fake Christianity, I mean, I believe that the religious revival was true, and indeed it was like that right after the revolution. But 27 years after, we have a whole new generation of people, many of them are urbanites, and you can't deny the secularization going on in that respect. And also all these churches that have been built, I think that social scientists have considered that as religious revival, but there is a huge economic ground behind this, because there is the interest of a priest to have a new church for him where he can stay for the rest of his life with no worries. There is the interest of construction firms, there is the interest of politicians who can recycle money, who can get electoral support by priests, because priests talk to an audience every Sunday and are a strong actor in influencing people in terms of votes, for example. And this has been quite sidestepped by scholars. That's right.
I think I will use the possibility of being a person with microphone and also ask my questions. Actually, I would like to ask you to elaborate a little bit more on the example of this cathedral, huge cathedral, which is under construction now, because for me it's extremely similar to the case of St. Sava Cathedral in Belgrade, actually, which is also under construction and which also has this Heintamanic ideas of being the largest Balkan cathedral, and probably this one will overcome this one. So it's a big question of like being the largest cathedral in the world, is it Orthodox or Catholic or whatsoever. So first of all, question of funding. Actually, also types of relation between the state and church in Romania, which is kind of unique. As far as I know, priests are paid there by state. If I'm not mistaken, please also elaborate on this issue as well. And discussion within the church, if you are familiar with different voices of clergy who are in favor of this idea, who oppose it mainly. So is there any discussion? And also a little bit more, not only about the religious revival in urban space, but also the whole public discussion in Romania. Because I heard the story about abortion law, which was, it was attempt to put it into, maybe not abortion, but
same-sex marriage.
Yeah, same-sex marriages. Yeah, that it was a huge company by the church and by state church-supported NGOs who collected over 3 million, as they claim, votes of people who wanted to put it into the constitution, that marriage is a joint union of male and female. So the whole sacralization of public discourse and so-called religious civil society which emerged in Romania. So could you please tell us more about this issue as well?
Thank you. Yeah, you rightly said, so that's a big deal now in Romania, about this attempt to change the constitution in order to prevent any same-sex marriage. And they were, as we were saying about the power that a priest has with an audience, they were able to collect 3 million signatures in a country which counts less than 20 million people, so it's a huge amount. I don't know how to reply. It's an interesting thing. I mean, I was concerned with public space, but concerning the material, the built environment. But if we talk about, as you rightly said, the presence of this segment of civil society who's close to church and was able to adopt the discourse of the classic civil society, then things get way more complicated. So you are definitely right. In this sense, you could say that there is a sacralization of the public space. So I totally agree with you. As soon as we leave the built environment and we move to the civil rights argument, things are way more blurred. So I agree with you. But still, there is still the referendum still has to come, so we will see how things will end up in the next months. I talked with priests and I found one close to Moldova who was totally unhappy with the construction, but it was the only one I found, and I talked with dozens of priests. So some of them were very happy with the construction of the cathedral, and some others were critical, but they recognized that the cathedral was needed in terms of logistics, because the current cathedral is very, very small and welcomes 300 people. And it's clear that for a national cathedral it's inadequate. And I was myself there, and indeed it was extremely small, and even on Sunday you had to stay outside because it was too small. And this project is it's 130 years old, so it was supposed to be built during the interwar period or before World War I, but for a series of problems and money that was put as disposal by the king back then disappeared and were used for education and constructions of schools. And of course back then it would have been so controversial to build a cathedral, but now, and in such a way, so using just public money, build something that is considered so megalomaniac and so big, because it's going to be the highest, Orthodox, the highest and the great, not the largest, but the complex, because as I showed you, it's talking about a complex. The complex will be the biggest of the Orthodox world. And this, of course, led many priests and most of all many believers puzzled, asking about, is it needed to have something so majestic? So that was quite basic in a country that is among the poorest of the European Union. So I think in that terms the doubts are quite legitimate. San Saba is a good example also because of the nationalist spirit which it was built, because San Saba is considered a hero against the Ottomans, against the religious and cultural other back then, right? So indeed, but it was built during socialist times already. It was started in the 1980s, where still it was Yugoslavia, while here it was built right after it.
Oh, no, just a sentence. So they jumped from a magnificent palace, Ceausescu's palace, to this magnificent cathedral. So that is quite a jump.
I agree. Is it that close you can actually jump?
Yes, but from one extreme to another extreme. And one, well, you mentioned Iliescu, who was party official,
yes,
a high-level party official during this so-called fake socialism, and now he is, as you mentioned, champion of Christianity. So that is a country of extremities, of extremes.
Yeah. Maybe you can find similar parallels also in other post-socialist countries. I don't know, you may find some.
Mr. Putin was a KGB man fighting communism, now he is a champion of Christianity.
Yeah.
So everything is fake then. So it developed as a, so neither socialism in the Soviet Union was real because it was fake, the Communist Party. Okay.
We can chat later on.
Sorry for this. Yeah, so you can continue with that after my question. I got interested because you mentioned actually about religious differences between you and your respondents. So my question is very typical for anthropologists. So what kind of methodology did you use, and how did you position yourself in this field? And to which extent you participated actually in your field, or you consider yourself to be a kind of neutral observer, a kind of more involved observer, and how do you think you made an impact on your field of study?
I stayed first of all like 12 months in Bucharest, and I used to live a few hundred meters away from the cathedral in a rather central area, and I used to go like almost every day to this small chapel close to the cathedral. And yeah, I mean, nobody told me that yeah, but you are criticizing the project because you are a Catholic, because I was also very cautious about that, and I was saying that I'm agnostic and I was raised in a Southern Italian Catholic family, but then I took some distance as anthropology would require you to do. So, and yeah, and actually what's interesting about this chapel is that the Patriarch sent the most appreciated spiritual father from Eastern Romania, from Moldova, to this chapel close to the, which is actually here, where you can see that, to this chapel close to the cathedral, in order to make community there. In this a few years before the cathedral will be built, and in this chapel you could always see people from 8 in the morning to 2 in the night. There was always somebody there going to, and I went talking with this priest. I explained to him that I wasn't Orthodox, because it's not nice to lie, especially to a priest, I don't know, but yeah. And yeah, it was, I mean, we had chats and so on, and it was interesting to see, like, every other church would have been closed, but there, in order to create a community, not to leave the cathedral empty during his religious life, Patriarch, who is a very good manager, sent the most important spiritual father right there to create a community. I don't know if I have any problem.
I would like to hear some more information, because you're showing us a lot of monuments and crosses, but actually I cannot understand where are the people. So you say that those things are made by public money, state money, you mean?
Yes.
So, for example, if you imagine that if the church has to gather money from people who are faithful, how do you think they could afford such things? Because I know that, for example, in Ukraine, very often people give really a lot for the church, because it's important for them. So they give more than they have for their own life. And for some people it's really important. So are there people in these churches? Are they needed, those places? And are they used? Maybe you have some pictures, some practice of this space and some...
For what concerns the cathedral, it's 100% funded by public money, even though the church says that it's just a bit, and they are always very elusive, but I spent time with all the data from state and every year how much money they gave, and so much. Up to now they spent around 100 million euros, and those are all public money, and even though they are collecting donations, and these donations are rather used for having always liquidity, cash, when you're waiting for money from the government, for example, or for paying taxes back. But that's just the biggest case. Like when there are also small churches in the outskirts of Bucharest, In that case, you have mixed funding, of course. So you have both people donating and those money are used, and both the money come from the town hall, for example. And there is a lot of church building in the outskirts of the city because, of course, all those neighborhoods built during socialist times had no churches. So you needed, as soon as the regime fell, there was a urgent need to build churches because people had to walk for kilometers to find a church. So in that case, people really contributed. But when it comes to such a huge project, at least in this case, it's just taxpayers' money, and this is why it's so controversial.
And why you call your presentation the City of Crosses? It's the City of National Cathedral. Because I understand there are some crosses and maybe it's something unusual, but they some of them are not even seen, as you told. So they are just there and they present something. But why a City of Crosses?
My supervisor wasn't happy as well. But I don't know, I wanted something catchy. Maybe it's not. I mean, thanks for your comment.
Because of this title, I came here.
So it was catchy enough.
So it was catchy enough. Then I keep it. No, I mean, it's full of crosses, but sometimes you can't see them. But yeah, I mean, if the Center for Urban History invites me next time, I will just talk about the cathedral. But that's up to you. I don't know.
Ще запитання. Ви можете задавати їх українською.
More questions, you can ask them in Ukrainian if more convenient. We do have an interpreter. No? All right. In that case, I think we can talk in a more informal atmosphere with our presenter. And at the moment, I'd like to thank you all for your time and for your presence. And also to say that over at the table, you can find information on the exhibition that's going on right under this room, in our exhibition room. It's called Undefined. It's open from Wednesday through Friday from 1 p.m. to 8 p.m. and then on Saturdays and Sundays from 11 to 6. It has an accompanying program. It's a series of public events and lectures and an educational program for students. You can find more information at our website. In the meantime, I wish you a very good evening. Thank you.